Thank you for tuning into the Texas Scratch King channel. Earl Tudor, the Oklahoma Kid by Don Mayfield. In 1951, after near 100 years of breeding game dogs in the USA, the breeding reached a peak. In Arizona, a male named Bouncer was bred to a female called Bambi by a man called Ed Richardson. In the litter was a red dog with a deep blue-black nose. This dog was bred from the core of American-bred game dogs. He was raised and named by a black man from a pup. This dog was named Debo. In the heart of Africa, the word Debo means devil. In his pedigree were over 100 years of American-bred game dogs that had been proven in the pit. All his close family were the gamest bred in the world. Debo and his close family was the product of this American breeding. His bloodline showed all the areas of the USA. The American game dogs in Debo's pedigree were dogs that proved their gameness in the core of the game dog game in America. These game dogs came into our nation near the mid-1800s from Europe. Some of the game dogs that were brought into our nation were of outcross breeding. When different pure families in England, Ireland, and Scotland were bred together in their nations, then imported into our nation and bred with either a pure or crossbred family, that were being matched into one another to prove which were the gamest families. Men like Cockney Charlie Lloyd imported pure family breeding and pure English breeding and crossbred it with the English breeding here in our nation. These men match few dogs, but proved their breeding was of the gamest bred. In the days of the late 1800s and early 1900s, Con Feely, who matched more dogs than any man in his time, became the breeder of the different outcross English families that had been bred here in the USA. Con bred a family of dogs from what he proved were the game's dogs bred in the USA in his time. F. G. Henry imported some English red dogs and crossed them with the proven family of the Con Feelys. In the same days, the English dogs were being matched, proven and bred on the northern coast of our nation. The Irish families were being done the same way in the area of the East Coast. J. P. Colby was a man that bred together different pure Irish game families with the Irish outcrosses that was being crossed together on the East Coast. A number of different men matched and proved the gameness of the breeding that were being bred at the core of the game. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Irish dogs of outcross breeding, the ones that were proving themselves as the gamest bred, made it to Texas in the yard of Bill Shipley. Bill imported a pure Irish family from Ireland and crossed it with the crossbred family that had been bred in the USA. In the early 1900s, the next name to fill the shoes of the number one game dog man of his time. And only a few men here in this new nation had wore these shoes. The last was Con Feely from Illinois. But in 1908, Earl Tudor showed up in Oklahoma from Kentucky. Earl matched more dogs and proved his understanding of gameness more than any man in his time. He bred together the families of F.G. Henry to the families of Con Feely. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Earl was proving his breeding the gamest bred. At that time, he crossed the dogs of the purest that had been proven of the English breeding to the Irish families of Bill Shipley, 200 miles from him in Texas. This brought together the game's dogs bred from the north and the gamest dogs bred from the east to near the center of the USA in the days of Earl Tudor, when he proved his breeding the gamest bred. Dogs from his breeding were being bred in most the states in the USA. This was in the 1940s. In the early 1950s, Earl Tudor was in Arizona looking at the breeding of the game dogs. When he was taken to see the dog Debo, Earl liked very much what he saw, and took the dog back to Oklahoma with him. At first he called this red dog Runt, but later he changed his name back to Debo. Earl bred Debo to a number of females bred from his family of dogs. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Earl began to bring together a family of dogs, breeding them pure. His dogs were different than any of the different families being bred in the USA. The ones from his families were the ones at the core, with most all the other breeding in the USA being of outcross breeding from Earl's yard. In the years of early 1960s to the early 1970s, Earl bred his understanding of American game dogs into a family of dogs that all looked alike. In the early 1960s to the late 1970s, we proved the gameness of more American game dogs than any man of our time at the core of the game before the game became against the law. Today, in the early 1980s, society around the world is seeking the gamest family of dogs bred in the world. Here in Texas, on a mountaintop beside a long creek, we have bred from the core a family of very pure American game-bred dogs. In the last number of years, we have bred only a small number of dogs from this family. At this time, when a number of nations are seeking the gamest family of dogs bred, it being the American game dog, it being proven in a number of nations matched into the different men's understanding of gameness. At this same time, Paul Harvey, a newsman, said, "In a nation today, man is trying to prove a dog has a spirit and soul that goes to heaven. I am an outcross-bred Texas man that has spent over 20 years looking into the insides of dogs. I am a believer the dogs house the spirit and soul of the devil. And is becoming man's best friend. Here in the USA where the people of the most outcross breeding are born. We are the breeders of the gamest dogs bred in the world. Here in Texas where the most outcross bred people in the USA are raised. We breed a game family of American game dogs to the point of gameness that only 3 kinds of people can bear to be around them. Those 3 kinds of people are people that feed them. And people like a saint. Are a person with the faith of the devil himself. The ones like the saint. The dogs will be scared of. And show fight along with the jump in his lap and lick him all over his face. But when a man of little faith looks eye to eye with this kind of gamebred dog, the man become within great danger of this dog. But the dog will be scared of the ones more like saints and turn their heads away from them. I have watched many of these game-bred dogs as they are looked in the eye of by a number of men we have met in our time with these dogs. I have looked also at the men when they do the looking. This story I write you seeker of game dogs comes from my understanding of the research we have involved ourselves within over the last near 25 years. Of game dogs and game men who I have been a lover of both. In my eyes the gamest man ever bred was our Lord Jesus. He being an outcross-bred man of God and mankind and took his death on the cross other than tell one little lie. That is the faith and spirit of a gameman. One fall morning at sunrise in the year of 1961 we met Earl Tudor at his home in Oklahoma. We had with us a nice bred female bred from his family of dogs. We came to meet him and talk to him about breeding the female. We did a lot of talking and bred the female. Then drove the near 250 miles back home in Texas. Within the next number of years we made the trip to Earl's place many times. On one trip I remember sitting on a couch with Earl as he had bad eyes and always wanted me to sit close so he could look me in the eyes when we talked. We most always talked about breeding. As we sat talking, trying to stare each other down, we had our own ways of understanding conditions and taught each other what we had done. And were doing. But when it came time to talk about breeding I only asked questions. I remember one time Earl, who was in his mid-60s about that time, broke down in tears and cried like a baby as he told me. These damn so-called friends of one dog deal or another who steal the credit of every dog bred. Never gave me one damn bit of credit for my dogs. Then he would wipe the tears from his eyes. Put his glasses back on. Get in my face and say, "It's all in the breeding, Don. It's all in the breeding." Then he would tell dogs and others. He would tell me about the breeding of those dogs as the pure ones. The family-bred dogs. Not the cross ones. The pure ones. Then I would say, "Earl, what was the best ones that you had?" He would cock his head. And his wife Flo would speak up and say, "The best dogs Earl had were the old Henry dogs. You never lost a match with a Henry dog, did you, Earl?" And Earl with a smile on his face would say, "You're right, Flo. The dogs of old man Henry's family were the red-eyed dogs and were game to the core." He would say to me, "The eyes were as red as a coon's eyes. They had a big mouth with a lot of muscle in the head. Most were black. But some were white. And some were red-nosed dogs." He said all the Henry dogs could bite hard and were very wild to work and handle. And like the preacher man from Oklahoma he would scream like a cat in the middle of the night. Get down on the floor on his knees and say they were deep game dogs. Bred of the English breeding. I sat there on the couch like a red-headed stranger thinking, don't cross him. Don't boss him. He's wild in his sorrow, he's ridden and hidden his pain. He would then get in his place and say, "They were good ones, Don." He was like a wild black stallion. And his wife, Flo, was as frail as a bay. His love for the game dogs was like a mountain so big. And for hours we sat and talked on and on. He would speak up like the bright lights of Denver of 10,000 jewels in the sky when he talked. Looking me straight in the eyes. He said, "If only I could call back the days when it was nobody's business where you're going. Or where you come from." Then, he would tell me about Debo. Demon. Black Jack Jr. And his sire and dam. He would say to me, "Don, in the 20s here in Oklahoma times were hard to survive. We fought dogs and cocks to survive. In the 30s the men still took an Indian squaw anytime they cared for one. Then in the days the winds came and blowed for 7 years it took 2 feet to 3 feet of topsoil from the farmland of the Irish race of people. And in those days when the Irish race in Oklahoma could not survive in the grapes of wrath, they picked up and moved to California to become the farmers of the world. In those days we had 3 pits on our place. We fought cocks and a few dogs each week for a number of years." He would then tell me. He had been shot 6 different times by 6 different men. And never once went to the hospital. The doctor came to his house. Once his brother-in-law shot him and they never called the doctor. As Flo dressed the hole where it went in. And the hole where it came out. He said, in those days we kept 7 dogs close to ready at all times. They were matched in 1 week's time. He said, I would run in the fields with my dogs. In those days, there were no fences to cross, just open land. He said, we had a mound built of sand with a chair that turned all the way around. We kept 7 dogs staked around the chair. I had a long fishing pole with a tail tied on a line. We would go from dog to dog for 2 or 3 with one working while the others worked the coontail. Earl then said, we never had a treadmill in those days. If we had one we wouldn't use it. The catmill was the best to work a dog on. And I would say, yes Earl, I know. I have one in my yard, and then he'd look me in the eyes and say, tell me the way you work 'em. And I would start to talk, telling him each and everything we did as his eyes started to shine, like saying, stay a little longer. As I talked on, he would move quick with his head high, saying, that's right, that's right. And as the stories were told over the years on his couch, we always ended in talking about breeding. As he would say, the Irish dogs were also deep game dogs. He would tell me about the different, pure breeding of the different families. Then, the tears would come with shakes. And the cry of agony as he looked me in the eyes and said, these damn so-called friends never gave me one bit of credit for my family of dogs. Those big shots Shipley and Feely, they got all the credit. Earl always called Bill Shipley the big shot. He sent his female Flash with a black man to be bred to Red Jerry. He would tell his black friend just what the dog looked like to breed the female to. He would then laugh like an angel flying too close to the ground. He would speak up and say, it was the English dogs, Don. You can hear these know-it-alls talk about the Irish dogs and they were good ones. But the English dogs was where it was at. Red-eyed dogs as red as a ruby. Wild to go, very hot dogs that would eat up a person. And Flo would speak up and say, Lord yes, as she pulled up her long cotton dress to her knees and pulled her knee socks down to her ankles to show her scars from dog bites. Earl then laughed and said Flo got bit 2 or 3 times trying to part some that would break loose when I weren't here. I got where I told her to stay in the house and let them fight to the death. So she don't get bit no more. She would speak up and say, Phyllis, those Henry dogs had a big mouth and you had to beat them in the head with a piece of iron to get them to turn loose. Earl would say, y'all, she's telling you the truth. She'd have a iron bar or hammer in her hand and if one got on her she'd beat it in the head and kill it. Then he would say, she's a sweet little old thing, ain't she? I don't know how I could have ever made it without her. Flo was a slip 5 feet 3 inch. Small woman of near 90 pounds. Earl being a small man. In his prime 117 pounds. With gloves on. He said he would have been a fighter if he had not got shot in the belly one time. As he said, Bert was the stronger fighter of us two. But I was like the sun from over the mountain with a sunlight that dances in your skin. But Bert, he did me wrong and I never him. And we would talk on about breeding. Earl carried the famous name of Tudor. The famous kings who went by the names of Henry I. And so on. In Europe. In the 1400s in England the way was open for the only surviving Lancastrian with strength to take and keep the throne. Henry Tudor was a descendant of John Tudor of Gaunt. He had spent half his life in Wales. The rest on the continent. Urged to intervene, he found Welsh forces eager to join him when he landed at Milford Haven. And led them on into England. King Richard met them outside Market Bosworth. Near Leicester. On 22nd of August 1485. The first battle was the gamebred war dogs. The royal army was larger but fought with less conviction. Many gnolls on whom Richard was relying had already decided to defect. Richard himself fought bravely, but was accorded little respect for this after his death. The crown of England found in a bush was placed on Henry Tudor's head. And the corpse of the dead king was stripped naked, tossed across a horse, and carried unceremoniously to Leicester. The last of the Plantagenets was gone. The stage was set for the Tudors. The mark of the Tudors were the dog and the dragon. Earl never told me he was from the English Tudor family. But he had the same little beady eyes as the pictures of the Tudors of England. He had the courage of a line of kings that would get in your face the last days of his life that came in 1977. Earl became a hard man to be around the last year or 2 of his life from the hate he had within. He kept a pistol in his pocket from sunup to sundown. And did a lot of crying the last years of his life. He told me stories about bad men he knew who always stopped and visited him as they came through east of the Texas Panhandle in western Oklahoma, where the rocks peer out of the ground in rows as if they had been planted. Poor land that at this time is too poor to grow weeds. He told me about a time he spent in court as they tried him for murder. He told me stories about life and game dogs that can only be told in a book. Earl Tudor was a man that liked all of us, that kept only 2 kinds of dogs. Those he liked. And those given to him by a friend. He started breeding his family of dogs in 1908 after being around them all his boyhood life. His first dog to match was a Henry-bred dog called Jack Swift. He bred him to a Henry bitch called Black Star and produced a dog called Judge. And he went to trial for 60 years, proving his value of truth and understanding of breeding to be unbeatable over the years. It was like a whiskey river that never went dry in most of Earl's grown life. He was the town bootlegger and his friend Jim Williams was the law. Jim always bred his females at Earl's house, and it was Jim Williams who led Earl's last stud dog out of his yard. Jim and Earl lived 19 miles from south to north from one another. On the same road. They were just another sample of two friends that had come to the point of hating each other from their many dog deals. But were friends to the end of them both. Earl would say of Jim, "That no good old pauper hanging dog peddler," and Jim would say, "I don't know why Earl talks too bad of me." Jim could come and deal dogs with Earl all his life, and he did. Earl would say about his life as a bootlegger and the law, that he never gave as much as a cigarette to. And he was never busted in his many years. And Jim, he would tell how he would call Earl and tell him to close shop till the state men left town. Each time the state men came to town to try and bust a bootlegger. Earl knew people like Pretty Boy Floyd, Baby Face Nelson, Frank Nash, who was raised just a few miles from Earl's in what was then called the Bad Land of Oklahoma when survival of life was hard. But like a Oklahoma preacher, Earl climbed high in his mountain and screamed like a cat. After walking from Kentucky when a young boy rode in a wagon pulled by oxen. But like a red-headed stranger that rode into Red Rock on a black stallion, he made his mark in the world of life and game dogs. And like he said, you can't hang a man for killing a woman who's stealing your horse. And out on the edge of life is where Earl lived in the Badlands of Oklahoma. He told me one time he won 24 matches in 24 months. He said, "Hell, there ain't nobody that can win 24 straight fair. Not even me." As he would laugh. And give me a fake right and left to the jaw. He was like the sun from over the mountaintop dancing in your skin. And like a lighthouse that stands alone, Earl traveled down the roads of life in and around Oklahoma. At one time he had over 100 game dogs and 200 cocks. He made his own cock spears from bed springs. But the game dogs was his love from the hate he had within of men. The game we as men play when seeking the gamest dogs bred. Is in life is seeking the true friend. After the man deals in life where men are having a hard time to survive in land that is called bad. As Earl cried out in pain from his butchered body as he lived one day at a time. He told me so many stories with so many different dogs' names. We talked for days. He lived by the graveyard where his folks lay to their amazing grace. As he too lay there to rest. But at the time of God's grace we will all arise and be counted for. As I can sometime hear his voice and spirit saying, "Go for it, Don. Go for it." It was like, "Take this job and shove it, I'll make it my way," and he did. But I tell you for sure his last years were as hard as any I have seen. He told me. He said, "Don, if a man told me could win over my dogs, I would tell him I would beat him within so much time," and he did. He told me, one time we were matched into the big shot. Shipley and his friends came down with an old-timer a month before he died of old age. His name was Frumble of Arkansas. He was a good old man. I told him after the dogs met. "Bet your money it don't go 20 minutes. And at 18 minutes the big shots dog fell dead in the center of the pit. And old man Frumble was the only man there that seen what I did. He shaked my hand and told me how glad he was to get to meet the Oklahoma kid before he died. He just hugged my neck and left. And said, 'I seen what you did. I seen.' And Earl just laughed and said he was one hell of a man, he was. One hell of a man. He then stood up, then he sat back down. And told me each time we visited many dog stories of too many different dog names to tell about at this time. Earl bred the Henry dogs as pure as he could and crossed it with the Feely and Shipley families from his understanding of what he had seen in the different matches of his life. Debo was a dog bred of 41 years of Earl's life. In the pedigree of Debo for 8 generations, the 3 men whose names show up the most was Earl Tudor of Oklahoma 39 times. Con Feely of Illinois 36 times. Bill Shipley of Texas 24 times. Compared to those 3 men, the others in the pedigree of Debo were game dog feeders. Those 3 men were at the core of the game where only the truth was. The female Gordon's Red Lady was an American-bred female where Tudor's name showed up 38 times in her pedigree. When Earl bred Debo to Red Lady, his name showed in their offspring's Jeff, Spike, and Buck 77 times. In the pedigree of Black Widow, Earl Tudor's name shows 69 times. When he bred Spike to Black Widow, his name showed in the pedigree of Baby 146 times. He then bred Spike's brother Jeff to Baby. And produced Nigger, his last and purest family-bred stud dog. His name appeared in Nigger's pedigree 223 times. He then bred Nigger to his sister and produced one lone female called Spooky. And his name appeared in her pedigree 446 times. Those two American game dogs were the purest bred of Earl Tudor's understanding of the game. He had played near 67 years of his life. And at this time, after he is dead and gone, there is still some of his so-called friends trying to take his credit of breeding. A side note by the Scratch King. Earl Tudor left a huge legendary mark on the game dog world and still today is highly respected by most if not all dog fanciers. The late Don Mayfield have always put Earl in high regards. Thanks again for listening to the Texas Scratch King channel. Until the next time, never submit to life and keep scratching every time.